Welcome to Political Talks. I'm Emma Tritton. This week's top stories in political news are Pyongyang, North Korea recently conducted its 5th nuclear test and is soon expected to do their 6th. It is part of its accelerated drive to develop missiles that can reach the continental U.S. with nuclear weapons. The era of strategic patience is over, stated Vice President Mike Pence. He was referencing the policy that prevailed for the Obama administration. The U.S. Supreme Court says it is not going to hear a case regarding federal law and undocumented immigrants. The cases involved women and children from Central America. The women say they fled to the U.S. hoping to receive asylum, to escape what they call gender-based violence. A federal appeals court ruled that women have no right to request a judicial review, and the High Court agreed. Some conservative Republicans in the South Dakota state legislature are still not happy with Governor Dennis Daugaard's decision to veto 2 bills that would have expanded gun rights in the state. Growing disagreements between him and the other party are just part of the, quote, evolution of holding office. The Trump administration's focus on enforcing the nation's immigration law is resulting in more arrests. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has arrested 21,000 undocumented immigrants in the first 2 months of the Trump presidency. That's a much faster pace than under the final 2 years of the Obama presidency. Officials say an executive order allowing ICE to go after a wider group of illegal immigrants is contributing to a growing number of people arrested. And now, USF Political Talks reporter Jill Langland is talking with Dr. Stephan Jackson about tensions in North Korea.
Thanks, Emma. I'm joined here today with Dr. Jackson. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we are here to talk a little bit about North Korea and how things are going on over there. Can you explain to us why U.S. has such tension with North Korea?
Well, I think right now, if we're talking about 2017, it's all about nuclear weapons. So they've developed nuclear capacity. We think they have atomic fission capacity, so they don't have hydrogen bombs yet. But they do have nuclear capabilities, and they do have at least medium-range missiles that can reach quite a few places in the Asia-Pacific region. They can reach allies, especially in South Korea would be the most immediate target, but they could also reach as far away as Japan. They probably don't have the capacity to reach the United States at this point. But if we're talking about why they're so scary, why they're so much of a threat, that's really what the threat is. For sure.
Okay. And then historically, why else do we have such tension between them?
Well, the roots of this go all the way back to the Second World War. So in that conflict, the Japanese take over this huge empire, and several freedom-fighting groups oppose them, one of which was supported by the communist regime. And then following the war, so we defeat the Japanese, and the United States and the Soviet Union can't agree on what's going to replace that previous regime. So what they do is they just sort of split the baby. They split the Koreas up into North and South. North Korea becomes the sort of brutal dictatorship that we know today. South Korea somewhat surprisingly, miraculously develops into a very vibrant, economically successful democracy. And that was not, nobody suspected that in the 1940s, but it's sort of a pleasant surprise of the late 20th century. And so as that has happened, North Korea has become more and more isolated to the point today where they're sort of an international pariah. They really only have one ally, and that's China here. And that's what sort of makes this really complicated, because the presence of China right on their northern border, the northern border of North Korea, makes this a really difficult policy matter for the United States, because we can't unilaterally take action, because that might get us into a conflict with the Chinese, a conflict that we've already had in the Korean War back in the 1950s. In fact, we got too far north with our invasion of North Korea, and the Chinese intervened militarily, which sort of set our forces back and created that dividing line between the Koreas that we have today. Technically, we're still actually at war with North Korea. We only have a truce, a ceasefire. We've never actually stopped being at war with them.
And in your opinion, how do you think we could settle these differences? Just either like not repeating history, or kind of explain that.
Sure. I think when you're talking about North Korea, you're talking about what's the least bad option. It is unlikely that we're going to get them to remove their nuclear weapons. From the perspective of Kim Jong-un at this point, that is his trump card, right? That is the most important deterrent he has to outside aggression. They know how isolated they are in the international community. They believe that nuclear weapons are the only thing protecting them from military invasion. So our objective should be to get them to get rid of their nuclear weapons. That's probably not going to happen. So the question is, what can we do to stop them from further developing their capacities? In particular, right now, the big struggle is they have the ability, or they are trying to develop the ability to develop intercontinental ballistic ballistic missile. So that would be a missile that could reach all the way to California. Most experts think that they don't have that right now, but within 5 to 10 years, they might be able to develop that capacity. And that's a really scary world that we'd be living in when they could deliver bombs that would reach, California rather than just sort of the Asia-Pacific region.
So what's the difference? So back in history, we had the Cold War between Russia. What's the difference between that and the situation between North Korea and us right now, besides the truce that we have?
Sure. Well, they're all sort of interconnected, and I guess you could say the North Korean situation is kind of a legacy of the Cold War. That it was this conflict is created because of Cold War tensions in the 1940s. It continues, and it gets one of the only shooting wars of the Cold War in the Korean conflict of the 1950s, and we're still dealing with this as a massive headache from the Cold War. But in terms of the different players here, they're the same, right? The United States of democracy. They're a communist country. They hate us because of our ideology and because we've opposed them for 50 years. And yeah, the conflict has sort of stayed in stasis, right? That's where we are, and it's a really tricky situation. How can any administration, and this is a problem that has bedeviled both Republicans and Democrats. No side has really figured out what to do here. But how can we, sort of nudge them more towards being a more acceptable form of state system, and also prevent them from militarily destroying one of our key allies in South Korea?
Thank you very much for joining
Absolutely.
us. I'll throw it back to you, Emma.
Thank you, Jill. Catch us next week for another edition of Political Talks. I'm Emma Triton.